My name is Sophie Harrison-Byrne. I'm the newly appointed director of the New Schools Network, and it's a real pleasure to be joining for this moment of celebration. We'll hear from Rachel Wolf and Sam Freedman today, who are key education policymakers who were involved in the first 10 years of the reform programme. We've asked Rachel and Sam to reflect on the establishment and successes of this landmark education policy. Before I hand over to them, just a few bits of housekeeping. You will have heard that this meeting is being recorded. I'd ask everyone to remain on mute so that there's no background noise, and we will be coming to questions after we've heard from Sam and Rachel. So please put your questions into the chat box, either as we go along or at the end, and I will try to get to as many questions as we can in the time. To begin with, I'm going to hand over to Sam. Sam is a senior advisor at ARC Schools and a senior fellow at the Institute for Government. He previously worked at Policy Exchange, where he did large research programmes on increasing choice and competition in the school system, and he was also a senior policy advisor to Michael Gove between 2010 and 2013. Sam, it's lovely to have you here. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Let me just start by apologising for the weird tint on my glasses. I can't control it, and I'm in a room with sunlight, so I look slightly mafia-ish for the purpose of this talk. Also, there's nothing like doing a retrospective to make you feel old. I remember, it doesn't feel like that long ago that Rachel and I were sitting around a table in Portcullis House discussing exactly how this policy was going to work. And here we are 10 years after it started doing a kind of, did it work or not? It feels like life moves fast. But anyway, what I wanted to do in my brief slot is just run through some sort of more positive comments, what I think has been a success, because I do think the policy, broadly speaking, has been a successful one. And then a few more critical points around, what I think, particularly around the time I was involved in them, we could have done differently, and what's happened since as well. So on the more positive side, the first thing I think to say is an idea that was seen as being completely far-fetched and was roundly mocked by the vast majority of the sector has become completely normalised as the way to build new schools. I think it's quite hard to remember, and probably some of you are too young to remember, back in 2009, 2010, when this was being mooted sort of as a serious policy for the first time, it was widely regarded as being very eccentric. It was heavily attacked as being proof that the system was about to be privatized, and that it was a backdoor attempt to get for profit into the system. It was going to be disastrous. You were going to have all these lunatics setting up schools, and in fact, now the policy is actually barely mentioned at all by critics of the government. It didn't feature in today's speeches at the Labour Party conference. It's just not it's not really a controversial policy anymore. And that is testament to all the people who work in the schools, all the people involved in the programme, New Schools Network and others. We've got well over 500 of them now. There's over 100,000 kids in free schools. They are part of the system, and they are now the standard way of building new schools. And I don't see that changing. Obviously there may be adaptations and adjustments to that policy, but I think it's with us for some time to come, which probably isn't what most people would have predicted 10 years ago. We also know they get pretty good outcomes, unlike the sort of wider academies policy, where I think it's pretty difficult to claim that en masse academies do better than maintained schools, and you get into very sort of complex arguments about statistics if you sort of try and make those comparisons. It's pretty clear that free schools, there are some good metrics that show free schools do very well. They do get better Ofsted outcomes. The NFER report that came out last year showed 35% of primaries, free school primaries outstanding, compared to 17% of other primary schools, and so forth. I think perhaps even more significantly, the same report showed that free schools get a lot more first preferences from parents in other schools. This is the sort of key test in a more market-based system, a quasi market-based system of success, is that parents want to use them. Not all of them. There have, of course, been failures, and there have been some closures, and there are some ones that struggle. But on the whole, parents are giving them more first preferences than they are to schools on average. And I think really critically, certainly if you look at the secondary free schools that have opened, pupils are more likely to be disadvantaged, and they're much more likely to be from an ethnic minority. I think, again, one of the criticisms of the policy, if you go back a decade, was, this is going to be used by wealthy middle-class people to set up little schools that are enclaves for their own children. We fought very hard for that not to be what happened. You could probably point to some examples where it did, but on the whole, that hasn't happened. The policy has seen more places in the right areas where there is disadvantage. It could have been more targeted, it could have been more focused, but overall, on average, it has had that benefit. And I don't think, it may sound like I'm equivocating or not being hugely positive. It's very difficult to put in place policies that work. If I look at all the policies that we did 10 years ago, there's plenty where I'd say either they didn't work or they had a negative effect. There are some I'd point to that I think have had a positive effect. Pupil premium, setting up the Education Endowment Foundation, and this is one of them. I think free schools has been a significant net positive to the system as a whole, and I think it's here to stay. That being said, I think there are some sort of more critical reflections I have looking back on what we did and what's happened since then. I think the first thing is, I really wish we hadn't called them free schools. They are legally the same as academies. There's no difference in terms of what they can do. I think it was really confusing and unnecessarily confusing to create two different names. Academies were already a known brand back in 2010. And there is still, I still have the conversation very regularly with people where they just get confused as to what the difference is between the two things. And there is no difference, except that free schools are new and academies are pre-existing schools. So I think we should have stuck with the name New Academies, which was the originally mooted name. And I still remember the meeting we had where we sort of ummed and ahed about what to call them. And I think, it was quite a close decision. And I think we probably landed on the wrong side of that decision. Probably a bigger point than what they're called is that we shouldn't have rushed the process. Michael Gove and others were very, very keen to sort of get the thing moving. Again, it's hard to remember now, but back in 2010, it felt like the coalition could be very short-lived and that Parliament might not have very long to go. And he was very keen to move at maximum speed. But it meant that in that first wave of free schools, the process wasn't strong enough. And some dodgy schools got through that shouldn't have got through, caused a lot of bad publicity, negative press, didn't help people who were trying to defend the programme. And it was just not necessary. We could have waited another year, done a better process. Then the process that sort of came into place and that Rachel was very involved in creating was much better. And future waves, particularly in that sort of the second half of Gove's time in power, were very much in line with what we'd hoped for. They were set up by strong groups with a clear vision. And many of those schools have gone on to be some of the best schools that we have in the country now in terms of academic performance. So I think it was fairly short-lived that the process wasn't good enough, but it meant that there was unnecessary criticism that was avoidable that lasted for quite a few years, because some of those schools didn't go wrong, obviously, for a year or two or three. And I think perhaps because of that, it led to somewhat of a backlash, both in the department and elsewhere in government, that has then led over the sort of more recent years to the system being overly controlled, in my view, and losing some of those things that made some of the earlier waves special. It doesn't feel like we're getting the same kind of innovation anymore that we did in the first few years. And maybe that's because there isn't an unlimited supply of innovative things that need to be done, and that's happened, but I don't feel that's the whole picture. And I feel like we are not creating the space for some of the more entrepreneurial. Some of the mistakes that were made in the early days have meant an overcorrection that we need to return to. And it's fine for Academy Change to be able to use the mechanism to set up new schools. That was one of its purposes. But it would be nice to see that kind of branch of innovation, particularly in the most disadvantaged areas, come back into the process. That used up a bit of time, so I'll just make my last couple of points quickly. The first is that there are a wider set of issues that aren't free school specific, but affect free schools with the current governance and regulatory structure that are kind of overhangs from the wider reforms in 2010. For instance, there is still no clear role for local authorities. It is not clear if we're moving to a fully MAT-based system, or if we are going to continue with this kind of dual running system for some time to come. There are multiple different regulators involved in free schools and academies that are different from the ones that are involved with maintained schools. There's a lot of unnecessary complexity. It's not clear who's responsible for improvement. There's a bunch of kind of system level stuff that needs to be resolved and has been just drifting since the 2015 white paper was ditched. And I'm very much hoping the new ministerial team pick that up, because it's been left too long. And then my final point, I mean, obviously I could go on for ages about that one, but that's almost a different topic of conversation, but I think it is relevant. And I think that my final point was related, which is we have there's a frustrating lack of research done on any of the policies that were put through, in 2010. The research capacity of the department was reduced. The research budget was reduced. So there's some research, the NFER stuff I mentioned earlier, and a couple of other small pieces, but there's very little detailed in-depth research on what's really gone well, what hasn't gone well, what we can learn. And I feel like we would really benefit from a proper research program on free schools to help us continue to refine and improve the process and policy over time. But I will stop talking.
Thank you, Sam. You covered a lot of ground there, and I'm sure there'll be people looping back to some of the stuff at the end, so we can probe into that a little bit further. I think people are still trickling in, but I hope everyone's back in the room, and apologies for that slight glitch. Just a reminder before I hand over to Rachel that if you have questions that are occurring to you as we go along, please put them in the chat now, so I can go straight to them once Rachel has finished. But it's a pleasure to welcome Rachel. Rachel is the founding partner of Public First, a policy and research consultancy. She was previously education advisor to the Prime Minister and was the founding director of New Schools Network. And Rachel also worked with Michael Gove when he was Shadow Education Secretary. Rachel.
Thank you so much. So I am going to make most of my remarks not on whether the free school programme worked, which I think it did, and I mostly agree with Sam, although I might come back to a couple of things at the end, or as a process in itself, because I actually think it is incredibly rare for a programme to go from a standing start to being, as Sam said, completely accepted, barely mentioned as a controversial topic in a relatively short period of time, particularly given how controversial it was at the beginning. And I don't think that was an accident. And actually, perhaps unsurprisingly, I would say New Schools Network played a big part in that. So I want to go back to what we were trying to do and why. I founded New Schools Network about a year before the 2010 general election. So about a year before free schools were actually a thing. And as Sam said, the general working assumption of not only opponents of the policy, but actually people who thought that it was quite a good idea, was that it would be a failure. So the conversations that I used to have at the time were, well, you should think yourself really fortunate if you get half a dozen schools set up within 5 years. This is broadly impossible to do. Or you are never going to find people who not only want to do this, but are competent to do it. I think the general mode from everything from former secretaries of state for education that I talked to onwards was that this was implausible. And it was implausible for good reasons, because it's actually really hard to set up a free school, as everyone who was involved in the programme early on particularly when it was a bit more Wild West. There wasn't an easy process. It wasn't obvious what you did. And a lot of the people we work with were trying to set up schools before it was even government policy, found out it is an enormous commitment in terms of time, emotionally, mentally, and it takes many years before you see the true fruits of your efforts. So it wasn't insane what these people said. But the reason that we set up New Schools Network, which was an idea I quite substantially stole from New York, from a relatively similar institution that had actually set up just after the charter school program got going, was to try and get enough good schools open fast enough that it did indeed become the norm, rather than making a government announcement, as often tends to happen, and sort of assuming that stuff will happen below where the minister is thinking. Actually try and connect all the steps from finding people who wanted to do it, getting them interested, trying to figure out the really boring things like, what does the form need to look like? What exact question should it ask? How do you make an argument? How do you persuade parents that this is worth having a go at sending your kids to? How do you do that run through? And the reason I dwell on that is because I think often these, what feel like quite boring third order questions are the difference between policy failure and policy success. And New Schools Network remains, in my experience, quite unusual in the public policy space. And there were lots of other people who helped me get it going and made it work. It certainly wasn't a solo effort. But it remains quite unusual in sort of thinking that through. I'll then kind of talk a bit about what I think was successful and what I think was less successful about the free school program, which remains a program I am incredibly proud to have been part of. I think has unquestionably added a lot to the education system and improved vast numbers of children's lives, and will probably be my greatest achievement. And I feel lucky to have been part of it, but nevertheless, no program is perfect. So what I think it has done, unquestionably, is allow a significant number of truly astonishing and entrepreneurial people, many of them teachers, some communities, some existing schools, to create much better schools for children and demonstrate what can be done, and in many cases very innovatively. And I think they have become, you've heard from lots of them in previous programs, and you will again in previous events, so I don't need to kind of list them, but they have become beacons for the system. And our sense was in 2009 and 2010 that there was, and I think it's still true, huge amounts of latent talent in the system, school system, that it was not easy enough I'm going to mix metaphors to kind of let flower, terrible mixed metaphors. And I think that was unquestionably achieved. Have we scaled them as much as we could have done? Possibly not. But I think they are beacons, and they are having an effect on the rest of the system as well as in their own schools. I also think, for what it's worth, that while the first wave of schools was more uneven in terms of its outcomes than subsequent waves, that there were very good arguments for that speed, and Sam and I can continue to debate this in Q&A. I think the first time you do anything, it's usually slightly messier, regardless of whether you waited 2 years or one, and I will betray my biases when I think there's always a good reason to wait another year, particularly when you're working with government, but I'm not completely convinced it would have made it vastly better. I think we needed to experience the teething problems of the first wave to get to the second. But I think perhaps a more substantial point is that if you have a program that is truly innovative, you have to accept that there will be some failures, and the question is how rapidly you act on those failures. I think the level of control and the lack of innovation is absolutely right. But I also think you have to accept that you will have a slightly higher failure rate if you allow that level of innovation. And that should be seen as a necessary part of a really successful system, given that the whole purpose of free schools is to generate that innovation. The area where I think we have succeeded less, in fact, I'm not convinced we ever really tried, was this concept of choice and competition, in that we have, I think through the free school program, created some extraordinary schools. We have created a bit more choice for some parents, but actually the decision was made pretty early on that almost all free schools were going to go in areas of basic need, which meant they were automatically going to fill up because there weren't enough places for the pupils otherwise. And one of the ideas behind the original free school program was that they would also provide a degree of additional choice so that school places didn't become automatically a rationing mechanism. Partly because there was a huge demographic bulge at exactly the time that we put this policy in, and partly because it's very politically difficult to do. I'm not sure we ever really tried that. And one of the results has been, in my view, that in areas where there are enough school places, but far from enough good school places, we haven't used free schools as effectively as we could. And I would love to see that in the next 5 years of the program. I do not expect it. But I should finish by saying I think that shouldn't distract from the fact that it has been an unusually and extraordinarily successful program from a standing start, and one that has changed what school leaders and teachers think are possible, and most importantly, done extraordinary things for a large number of children. So I'm grateful to have done it. I'm grateful to have been invited back to talk about it, however briefly, and look forward to talking more in questions.
Thank you, Rachel. It's wonderful to hear from you both and to hear all of that history. I am awaiting any questions in the chat, but I'm sure there must be some. I will pose two whilst people gather their thoughts and gather typing. Sam, you talked about the kind of golden era of the process, of the sweet spot where it was sufficiently controlled but not yet overly restricted. And Rachel, you then also spoke about those schools that have gone on to be the beacons of the system. And I think you're in essence talking about the same waves. And then Rachel, you kind of went on to say that, you know, you do have to accept failure. So I guess a question for both of you is, how do you think is the best way to get back to that kind of golden era in terms of having that space for innovation? And if you were to have a slightly higher tolerance to risk, the inherent risk, what would be the best way to manage that? Rachel, you said about, you know, how you address failure or how long you wait to address failure. I don't know, Sam, if you want to take that first.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is just about what you say. You know, it's been a while since Secretary of State has made a notable speech about free schools. And if you just let the system get on with it, then the system will become safe and bureaucratic. That's what happens with any system. So I think you'd have to have a minister or a Secretary of State who said, you know, we want this to happen. We want this type of person to come forward. We're going to actively look for these superstars in the system. I'm going to make an effort to find you out, to work closely with you, to help you build your vision. Because at the moment it's, you know, come forward if you meet this incredibly long list of criteria, which is going to be on the whole academy trusts who are able to go through that process. So you just have to. A lot of it is not about the exact details, it's about the orientation of the policy. Then once you've oriented, you then need to make sure the process fits with what you've said, and you need to make sure that there is, you know, you perhaps take some of the bureaucracy out, you make it a bit simpler, you give people a lot of support, some cash to, you know, maybe hire people if you feel there does need to be a process that's gone through. You know, but I think the process is actually lesser to the policy intention, and that can only come from ministers.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think we put a huge amount of effort from New Schools Network, but also large numbers of speeches from the Secretary of State and the Minister, and lots of press effort to make people aware that we wanted them to come forward and set up free schools, that it mattered to us. And a huge part of what New Schools Network did in the first year or two was smooth any obstacle, knock down any barrier. We put barriers in place in terms of, are you capable of thinking this through and doing it? But if they were finding it hard, if they had, as happened, we had teachers who had terrible problems within their school because it was found out that they might want to think about setting up a free school, or there were challenges with the unions. And we spent all our time trying to make clear that we were on their side and excited about what they were doing. And this makes a difference to whether people want to or willing to do it. Downing Street held parties for people who were setting up free schools to say, thank you, it's wonderful what you're doing. We're so excited about this, right? This makes a difference. And so that's a long-winded and more anecdotal way of agreeing with Sam, which is that you have to send these signals. It's not obvious to me what the equivalents of Ed Venker 12 years ago are now doing, but I think they are slightly less likely to be setting up free schools.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think Ed Venker would necessarily have been approved if he'd applied in more recent ways. Yeah,
and
absolutely.
this is the downside of the institutionalization of this, and again comes back to risk.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both. We have some questions from the floor. I'll start with one from Fred Sharrock. I'd be interested in any reflections on the success of different types of free schools. So I think there might be some misconceptions just to address here first. I might give this to you, Rachel, but different types of free schools, mainstream, special, UTC, and 16 to 19, and the reasons for that. So just before handing over to
I never thought of UTCs as free schools.
They're not. No, they're not.
I never had anything to do with the program. But I'm happy to talk later about why I don't think UTCs worked, but that may not be what you want to talk about. So you are all probably more up to date on the precise stats on this. So my sense is, although they're harder to measure, that many of the special and AP free schools have been very successful. And I think actually the AP schools are the ones that I'm aware of that have been particularly innovative. So I vividly remember working with football clubs on AP free schools. And they inevitably do have more institutional backing, and probably rightly. And that's true of special schools as well. But certainly my sense is that they've been a success. I actually think on 16 to 19, I think one of the most innovative groups of free schools have been the maths schools. And they have identified and brilliantly filled a very specific gap, which was there were and are too many naturally very, very talented, in this case, mathematicians, who cannot get the level of teaching at their current schools that allows them to fulfill that talent. UTCs, I think, have not succeeded, but it would take me a while to say why. So we can come back to it if people are interested, but and that's free schools. Sam, what would you say?
I'm quite happy to talk about why UTCs haven't succeeded. Yeah, that was never a program that I was particularly keen on, but Ken Baker is a persuasive man. On the sort of the only other point I'd add to Rachel's, and it's probably a point where we disagree actually, on the 16 to 19, they have been successful as a group, those free schools, but I don't like the way they're increasing the tendency towards selection post-16. I think post-16 selection is not something we should be encouraging. There are obviously some grounds for it that don't exist at 11. There are vocational academic programs. There does need to be some sorting at that age in terms of what's most appropriate. But the tendency to push up that selection to be more elite is I think creating a risk around segregation, social segregation in the post-16 sector of that group that would have otherwise done academic qualifications. So that's my only nervousness about that specific bit of the picture. AP and special, I don't really have anything to add to Rachel. I think from what I can see, that's been a really good addition.
Yeah, I don't agree, but that's more about a function of what you think of the role of 16 to 19 education, and nor does Sam and I agree about selection at universities. So, which I also think it's perfectly reasonable for them to be selective, but we can come back to it.
Yeah, there's quite a few other questions. So yeah, one around if there is limited appetite for innovation nowadays, what do we do next? Do we ask the likes of Ed Benker, Catherine Berbelsing, Peter Hyman, etc., to open Reach Michaela and School 21 across the Red Wall?
So, I mean, I think we're going to keep coming back to the same point, which is that you will only get more innovation in free schools if ministers decide that it is important to them to have more innovation across free schools. This is not fundamentally down to Catherine or Ed. This is down to departments setting the direction. I guess my secondary point would be that it seems to me that even incredibly successful school groups have struggled when their geographical reach gets too broad or dispersed. And also that while I think there are things that are universally successful about Reach or Michaela, I also think that there are some really substantial differences in terms of what you would need to deliver in a, say, Red Wall town than an inner city borough. But yes, what you would hope is that you would get very talented teacher groups who either through the kind of traditional free school model or through what they did in America and New York, which is effectively to chop schools in two and allow one half to be taught by one group and the other half by another, to start generating some real educational options, because those do not tend to be areas with growing populations.
Thank you. Sam, unless you have anything burning to add to that, I'll go to some other questions.
I'm happy for you to go to another question.
A question from Stephen Mundy. Many thanks for the interesting reflections. Sam, you seem to confirm the original vision of innovation being part of the programme had fundamentally disappeared. Do you see this as part of a general, this is quite a similar one, and across the system, everything must be evidence-based and there are certain ways that things work and must be done. So such an approach is hardly like to support the notion of innovation. Right. I'm not sure if there's anything to add there.
Yeah, I would. I mean, I think it's worth saying that I do think this is part of a wider issue across the department, and I think that comes from having. Michael Gove was an incredibly unusual Secretary of State. He was had a very clear sense of what he wanted to do. He was very driven. He put key people that he knew were supportive of what he wanted to do in key positions in the department. He did it. Everywhere he's gone, he's achieved more than anyone else who's tried to do that role has in the last decade. And we haven't had that from any of the Secretaries of State since. And it does require that if you're going to constantly, because the natural tendency of any large bureaucracy is to make things safe and risk-free. I don't think it's really got much to do with evidence. I think it's about risk. And large bureaucracies will always fight against risk. Michael is the only Secretary of State that I'm aware of who always chose the most risky option in any submission he was ever given. He actively, civil servants put 3 options in, and the middle one's the one you're supposed to choose, and he always went for the 3rd option. That was the kind of, but you need that kind of, perhaps not quite at the same level that he did, but you definitely need that kind of impetus coming from the top to drive innovation, not just in free schools, but in everything the department does. And that just hasn't been there. There's been this drift. There's not been any white papers. There's not been any kind of sense of what we're trying to do with this system. And to be fair to the Secretaries of State that have come since him, they haven't had the same opportunity to develop their ideas in opposition, to work with people like Rachel in opposition, and they've had to come into an existing system that wasn't their idea and try and adapt it. But we just haven't had the same energy or drive or direction, and that is then felt across the department.
It's also a bigger department now, right? So it's now a department which has schools and also FE and skills and higher education. And to the extent that I see reform energy in the government in that kind of broad area, I see it much more in skills, where I suppose I should declare an interest knowing one of the advisors, but much more in skills than I do in schools.
And I guess a follow on, given Michael Gove's new role following the reshuffle, do you have any sense of where he might go in terms of recovery and education in some of the areas that need to be levelled up?
It's a difficult one. I mean, because cross departmental working in government, as anyone who has ever attempted to work in government will know, is extremely difficult. And if whoever, if the Secretary of State of the DfE starts letting this new levelling up department start getting involved in education, that's going to create all sorts of turf wars. So I'm not sure. I think he'll probably focus on other things and not education, but I don't know. I mean, he might not.
Can I come in on something that is in no way a question that's come up? But I sort of feel like we have been quite sort of doom and gloom, and the energy is gone, and isn't it all sad, and wasn't it wonderful while it lasted-ish? And sort of suggesting that, we just need to sit and hope for a Secretary of State to turn up and re-galvanize anything. And I don't think that's completely true, in that I do think that you can, and one can, affect things from the outside. So if, for example, you got together a significant enough set of potential red wall schools with parental backing, I think that there is unquestionably a campaign that could re-galvanize, along with all the amazing work you're already doing. I get that this is not your day job, that could re-galvanize the program. I do think that there is a desire and need for more reform energy in most departments, and including this one. So I don't think it's sort of over, but I do think it needs that outside impetus. And if we go back again to the kind of early years of New Schools Network, it was a campaign before it was a delivery program, and it operated as a campaign before it operated as a delivery program. And I think that is probably what needs to be recaptured, which is not easy, but I do think it is doable.
Thank you. Another question from the floor. We've discussed the lack of research, and we have a representative from Cobham School, which opened in Wave 2, and they have music and creativity as their central innovation, and they just wanted to note that they've conducted their own action research with the University of Northumbria, which is currently doing a study on the success of their innovation. And it may be that there are more schools participating in their own research programmes. So thank you very much for that comment, Michaela, and we'd be very happy to see the research once it's published. Going back to that point, Rachel, are you aware of any other organisations internationally that are similar to New Schools Network, other than the one that you mentioned in New York, perhaps in a different policy area, but that quite unique organisation that is the kind of delivery implementation mechanism for?
And perhaps I should be. I'm not really, and I also feel like I've seen quite a few in the UK try and not really succeed. Although I think usually the reason for that is that they were not focused enough on what they were trying to do. So at the same time that we set up New Schools Network, there were some other organizations that tried to do other parts. If you think this is part of what was then called the Big Society, you're probably all way too young to remember the Big Society. It was a big deal once. And generally, and also with sort of mutuals and various other things, and generally didn't succeed, because I think the advantage New Schools Network had was a combination of supportive political environment, unquestionably mattered, and a very, very clear sense of what it was trying to do, which was find people who wanted to set up free schools and try and help them do it. And that is often, and others in education were similarly successful. Teach First has been incredibly successful. There have been lots of other recent things like Oak that I think have been incredibly successful and similarly focused. I'm not aware of any that have done it in other policy areas, other than in recruitment as successfully. But Sam, you may know.
No, not really. I don't think there are many other examples of yeah, again, it took an unusual combination of people to, I think, to make New Schools Network happen. And I don't think that that's very common in politics.
Absolutely. I think on the red wall, going back to the red wall point, I think there are a number of the 2019 intake that have been incredibly keen on getting free schools in their areas, but have sadly been kind of hitting a wall.
That's okay. Okay, so like that, then what they need to do is band together, and if they hit a wall privately, they start talking about it publicly. And then you get the, like, these things don't happen because you say you send a letter and someone says no, and then you go, oh, they said no, never mind, wouldn't it be nice to happen? I know this is not what's happening, Sophie, but like, it's really, really, really hard to change things, and you have to be brutal about it for a really long time if you want it to change. There is no shortcut for that. And I don't know the Red Wall MPs, obviously, you know, they're all finding their way in politics, but they also need to realise this if they're going to get their way.
I think dogged determination is a hallmark of free school leaders. You talked about, you know, how much work it takes, and yeah, not kind of giving up at the first bump in the road. We have a question that's about the changes to the process for special free schools. I don't know how familiar both of you are with that. In essence, they're no longer delivered through the central application process. It's a partnership with the local authorities, where the local authorities are identified and in essence create the specification for people to then apply to. So this question is around kind of, what do you think of that drift in that process?
I mean, without knowing the details, it sounds precisely like the system we were trying to change in the first place. And that is a sense you get a little bit occasionally, that we have returned to the system that that was exactly what was trying to be reformed, but I don't know the details.
No, I'm not. I don't know about the details of that process, although I think it goes to all the broader points we've been saying throughout about the challenges that the additional bureaucracy that's been put into the system have created. And I see a comment saying same for AP. It doesn't, none of that doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, and I think the comment there is that their APs are delivered through the same mechanism, and because of the different funding models for both type, there's less of an incentive for a local authority to bid for an alternative provision in their patch. So sadly, we've only seen 2 approved in recent waves. So that group of really high quality alternative provision hasn't grown that much, and is not reaching kind of areas of the country where it's needed. I'm just having a skim of any remaining questions. I don't know if either of you want to pick up on anything that you've spotted whilst I'm doing that.
No, I think the truth is we've been talking about the same thing consistently, and it is the thing, and I'm sure it's the thing that you also feel, Sophie, and others who work for New Schools Network, which is this has been an amazing programme. It has created a huge number of schools we should be proud of. It has allowed great academy groups to expand. And the fact that we get to reflect on it 10 years later is a wonderful thing. But it does need rejuvenation. And we can hope for the rejuvenation from the inside, or we can try and figure out how to create the rejuvenation from the outside. But that is the point, and that is in itself a mark of success. You don't get to be the boring, lazy program that just runs along wheels unless all those things went right. But we are now in that next phase.
Yeah, I would just, there was a question right at the top, the first question that was asked. I don't think we've talked about, so if you were back in the department advising the new Secretary of State, what would you be saying about free schools? I mean, I think my, if I was back there, I would not be saying go and do something specifically on free schools. I'd be asking them, advising them to do something more general about the whole system, because I do think there is a, as I said sort of earlier, there is this sort of drift and confusion about the purpose of the structural reforms in the future. I think you have to tackle the whole academy system, and what the aim is for that over the next decade, as it has been over the past decade. And free schools are an important part of that, and free schools can do something different within that system to other aspects of the policy. But it should be seen as one big picture. And I would be averse to taking any little bit of that picture and trying to run away with it without looking at what's the role of the local authority? How do you coordinate services in a system which is not set up in localities? How do you regulate? How do you govern, these organisations? There's just a whole set of big questions that need to be picked up, in my view.
And do you have a view, Sam, on what that system should look like in the next 10 years? Do you have any view on full academisation or? Yeah,
I mean, I'm still forming a view, I think, having recently come back into the English education system, having been doing international work. I think there are some big advantages to full academisation. It allows you to give LAs a clear role because they're no longer split between trying to do multiple different things. I think it creates clarity around the system and allows you to build a school improvement process for a particular model in the future. But there are costs to it. There's big opportunity costs. That it's a big thing to do. Use up a lot of political capital. It means you can't do something else which might be more useful or more important. And I wouldn't want to downplay that. It is politically tricky. I mean, Nicky Morgan tried, and lots of Conservative councils got upset. So I think you'd have to be quite clever about how you worked with LAs to do it. But it would be my preference. I think running as a dual system is just not permanently sustainable, even if it's not the biggest problem we face right now.
And same question to you, Rachel. Do you have any?
I think the only thing I would add that's different from what Sam said is if I was sort of advising the Secretary of State, is the original free school program, the free school program, was fundamentally about parents and children and what school they got to send their children to. It was about trying to create a bottom-up mechanism that allowed people to have an impact on the system as much as a top-down one. And I think that's something we're generally execrable at. And one of the interesting things about COVID, which as someone who homeschooled was generally a miserable experience, so I wouldn't wish it on anyone, but it forced parents across the country to confront the content and detail of what their children were learning for the first time. And I think the interesting opportunity beyond systemic organization is how you capitalize on that and galvanize it. I think we're very bad at it. And if you're looking at the Red Wall, for example, and the sorts of places we do a lot of focus groups, so let's take, the East Midlands, where schools are fairly uniformly as good as each other and often not as good as they could be, and where there aren't sort of these beacons and it is not at all obvious what else you should be expecting as a parent. I think one of the most powerful things you can do, whether it's through new schools or other mechanisms, is make them aware of what good looks like and try and create those bottom-up mechanisms. That's one of the ways I would be thinking. I'm sure Sam disagrees with it, so maybe we should have done it 45 minutes ago. But I guess it's a way of saying that there do seem still to me to be substantive reforms that can happen and that achieve some of the aims that free schools were designed to achieve.
Thank you both. I think we have time just to share two final comments from the floor. So Marie Conville, just another shout out for the huge success of AP Free Schools and the role that they've played in raising standards of provision for children that aren't thriving in mainstream, and a plea for a change in process to ensure that we see more AP Free Schools in the future with more equitable funding. And yes, just a comment from John, just saying pleased that you answered that question, Sam, at the end there, and Rachel, and the kind of role for greater coherence in the system around teaching schools and ITT and other areas which are potentially adding to confusion. So thank you to our delegates for those thoughts. And that just finally leaves me to thank you both, Rachel and Sam, and all of our delegates for your questions. It's been really fantastic to hear from you reflecting on the last 10 years, but also your thoughts for the future. And I look forward to discussing it with you both further in more detail. And then finally, just a reminder that this is the second of 3 events that we're running in this series. So next Wednesday, I'd be delighted if you could all join us for our final session, which is more explicitly focused on the future. So where next? For the reform programme, and we'll be joined by Dame Rachel D'Souza, Sahamid Patel and Martin Oliver, so that will no doubt be as engaging a session as this one has been. And also for free schools in the audience, we have a few other events that you might be interested in. We're running a spotlight visit to West Cliffs Primary in Exeter on the 19th of October, and I believe that can be accessed virtually as well if you're unable to get down to Devon. And that is a free school and a trust which has a strong focus on using technology in the classroom. And we also are running media training for open free schools, and there are various dates available for those. So please do go to our website to find out more about them. And that just leaves me to end the meeting, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.